Hello and welcome back to Analysis. Family and friends of Talha Ahsan held a vigil outside Parliament last Saturday to mark 1 year since his extradition to the United States. After spending 6 years in a high-security prison in the UK, Talha Ahsan was extradited to the US together with 4 other Muslim detainees. Of these 5, Talha Ahsan's case is amongst the most controversial. Here's Alex MacDonald with more.
One year ago on Saturday, Talha Ahsan was extradited to America along with Babar Ahmad and Abu Hamza on charges of conspiring to support terrorists in Afghanistan and Chechnya.
Talha Ahsan is a British-born poet and translator. He was very tragically extradited 1 year ago today after over 6 years of detention without trial. He still hasn't even been convicted of anything or given a trial, and he's in a death row type prison regime. Extradition is there for fugitives, if people ran away, not for someone who's never actually been to the United States. So Talha's also a victim and survivor of a very unjust and rotten law.
Media coverage of the original extradition focused overwhelmingly on the notorious hook-handed preacher Abu Hamza, who was already a bogeyman figure in the British press after being convicted in 2006 of soliciting murder and stirring up racial hatred. Neither Babar Ahmad or Talha Ahsan had previously been convicted in the United Kingdom prior to their extradition, which occurred under the auspices of the 2003 US-UK extradition treaty. Controversy erupted when on the 16th of October 2012, less than 2 weeks after the extradition of Talha Ahsan, Home Secretary Theresa May blocked the extradition of hacker Gary McKinnon due to the likelihood of him ending his own life while in prison as a result of his Asperger's syndrome. The blocking of McKinnon's extradition led to accusations of double standards, as Talha Ahsan had also been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome.
Theresa May showed some horrific double standards in blocking the extradition of Gary McKinnon, who I also supported, on the basis of Asperger's syndrome and assessed risk, which Talha also had and was also medically diagnosed with. So it's a very brutal thing to do, and given the fact that both Theresa May wanted to abolish the Human Rights Act prior to that, and also you have to consider the prison regime he is under. I mean, according to the America's own statistics, 50% of prison suicides occur in solitary confinement regimes, according to their own congressional senator, whilst only compromising like 3% of the prison population. So it's extremely worrying.
But the Home Office denied they had made a mistake, saying in a statement, "Each case is decided entirely on its own merits. Talha Ahsan's case was considered at length by the UK courts and the European Court of Human Rights, which decided that extradition to the United States would not breach his human rights." There have also been suggested that the US-UK extradition treaty disproportionately targets UK citizens. According to a Freedom of Information request revealed in The Telegraph, no US citizens have been extradited from the US to the UK under this treaty for crimes committed whilst the person was in the US.
It is one-sided, it is unbalanced, because America can take anybody from here without anything, but British government can take any American citizen from here. So you can say it is one-sided.
Civil liberties campaigners from across the political spectrum have criticised the US-UK extradition treaty, claiming it undermines British sovereignty and needs reforming. Theresa May has said she will introduce a forum bar, meaning a court hearing must take place to decide whether any person facing extradition should not instead face trial in Britain, a move that was hailed by campaigners, but which comes too late for many extradited Muslims. For Talha Ahsan, whose trial proceedings are set to begin in America in March 2014, there is now little chance of him being tried in the land of his birth.
Gary McKinnon's mother is praying for my brother as an act of solidarity. So she wrote, "Dear Talha, we are deeply saddened that you are alone, thousands of miles from home, and pray that you will soon be back in the UK where you belong. You are in our heart and in our thoughts and the thoughts of many who are praying for you. You may feel alone, but people in the UK are with you in spirit, willing you to be strong until the worst is over and you are returned home again. Janice Sharp and family."
Alex MacDonald, Islam Channel.
Well, with me in the studio to discuss whether there are double standards in UK extradition law are Hamja Ahsan, who you saw in that report, who's the brother of Talha Ahsan, and Bill Bowring, who's Professor of Law at Birkbeck University of London. On the phone, we're joined by Victoria Brittain, who's formerly the Associate Foreign Editor at The Guardian. Victoria, just let me bring you in first here. Is there now any chance whatsoever that at some point there will be a transparent and fair justice seen to be done with Talha Ahsan?
Well, that's a very large and loadedly phrased question, John. Because, of course, the betrayal of Talha and also of Babar Ahmad and two other men who were extradited at the same time, Khaled al-Fawwaz and Abdul Bary, all of them were failed by the British court system. The two latter men I mentioned served 14 years here when accused of absolutely nothing, waiting for a decision to be made to send them to America. Talha and Babar spent 6 and 8 years. Now, all of this is completely unacceptable in terms of our image of what Britain is meant to be. And Bill, I'm sure, will talk more about the legal scandal that lies behind this. But the fact is that today we're in a completely different situation. They're all 4 of them in different prisons in America, 2 in Connecticut, 2 in New York. And they're involved in an American prison and justice situation in which since 9/11, according to, and even before, in fact, in some cases, according to most of the American lawyers who really understand and have worked on these cases all these years, is flagrantly unfair to Muslims. And you have only to look at the example of Guantanamo Bay, which has 160 people, many of whom have been cleared twice by the American authorities in order to be freed, and are still not freed. This is where the double standards comes in. And I would just like to add 2 things. One, my tremendous admiration for Hamja, for the work that he does for consciousness raising around his brother and the others involved in this issue. But secondly, just to clarify something that was in that earlier clip, I think the double standards, when you talk about Bary and Talha, it's important to remember that both of them, of course, did have Asperger's. But Gary's case was unique in that he and his family openly said repeatedly that he would kill himself if he was extradited to America. Talha and his family have never played that card, so to speak. I don't mean that there's anything untrue about Bary, but he handled it in a different way. And that was the pressure on Theresa May, coupled with the Daily Mail's pressure on her, which made her make the decisions that she made on these cases so differently and so grossly unfairly.
Bill, isn't really what's happening here is that successive governments have decided to create a kind of legal black hole around terror cases, and that that's what's really happened to these people?
Well, I'd say the decision has been taken actually in the United States of America, and Britain has gone along with it. And I think that's the way that one has to look at it, really. And I think particularly when you note the fact that neither Gary McKinnon nor Tatler were charged with anything here or prosecuted with anything here, and what they wanted for is in the States. I also note, actually, by the by, that the conditions in which Talha's being held in the United States, and he's somebody who's not being convicted, and they are conditions which no prisoner in the UK has to suffer, actually, even terrorist suspects.
Hamja, I mean, tell us a little about this. I mean, it must be a terrific burden for you to have somebody as close to you as this under these conditions. But is that the picture that you get, that really what's happening here is that somebody's being held in conditions as if they'd already been convicted of crime?
Yeah, the prison regime my brother's under is actually this similar to a death row inmate. He's actually housed opposite death row inmates, and yeah, this is without even being convicted of anything whatsoever. You know, so you spend 23 hours a day in a room the size of your bathroom without any human contact. Sometimes 24 hours a day if there's if there's lockdown as well. Something the United Nations Special Rapporteur wanted to abolish, and given the fact Herman Wallace, who spent over 40 years in solitary confinement in the United States, it's just basically the last form of torture and legalised abuse no one talks about. And it's what unites Bradley Manning, Guantanamo Bay, Palestine, all the horrible prisons we see in the war on terror, like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, they originate from the domestic supermax system. Everything from prolonged solitary confinement, force feeding, forced cell extraction, they have those origins, and we have to remember that, and that there's actually a lot of continuities between that earlier war against the Black Panthers and Black liberation movements and the American Japanese people and what's happening now, the war on terror.
Bill, is there any chance, and the question I asked Victoria right at the beginning, is there any chance that there can be a fair outcome from this process, a fair judicial process?
I'm afraid to say that the cases we've seen so far in the United States, Victoria mentioned Guantanamo. I think that's evidence enough that one really does not get a fair hearing in the States. Another case which is also absolutely shocking at the present moment is the American civil liberties human rights lawyer, Lynn Stewart, who's being held in similar conditions on the basis of similarly very flimsy charges, and is at the moment on the point of death, actually. So there's one scandal after another. What I found particularly disappointing was the European Court of Human Rights, and probably you'll ask me about that in a moment.
Hamja, is it down now really to political campaigning to make this case such a hot case for the authorities that they can't just routinely bang your brother through an unfair judicial system?
Well, there was a nationwide campaign behind Talha and Babar Ahmad. Babar Ahmad's petition got 150,000 signatures. Something Caroline Lucas brought up in Parliament is that all these hundreds of thousands of people who'd integrated, who'd gone through all these peaceful civil processes, will be just alienated, by the extradition. It's a very simple thing we're just asking. I didn't think I'd be sitting here 7 years later. This could have easily been sorted out in a British court of law as a matter of fairness, logic, and common sense. If there was basics. Forum rule, which we still campaign for. In terms of whether he'd be, we had to put pressure on the government to repatriate him immediately. I mean, Tony Blair, in earlier cases, actually intervened in the NatWest 3, the very first high-profile British bankers case, to have them serve their sentence in the UK, because British citizens who've never, voted in America or vote for the laws, they shouldn't be subject to those type of abusive prison regimes.
Victoria, do you think that the situation perhaps is this in the States now, that the Obama regime has stepped back from the kind of most extreme rhetoric that we heard about the war on terror under George W. Bush, but that in all sorts of ways, in drones, in special forces operations, and in the legal system, it's still continuing the same policy?
Oh, very much so, and. How ironic is it that in halfway through the second Obama term, one has to really come to the conclusion, sadly, that this person is worse than Bush in terms of the willingness to do many of the things that you've mentioned, the continuing drone attacks, the extralegal assassinations, the entering other countries, such as only yesterday, both Libya and Somalia, to carry out either assassinations or arrests. And that's before you even talk about what was mentioned by Hamja, cases like whistleblowers like Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snowden. The way the Obama administration has gone after whistleblowers and people who've attempted to try to get more light on the very dark corners of the American legal system has been absolutely vicious.
Bill, what you were just saying now about the European Court of Human Rights, what provenance would it have? What could it have done here?
I think the first problem is that although they have no difficulty in condemning, for example, Russia in case after case, and conditions are certainly very bad in Russia, of course the United States is not part of the Council of Europe or the European Convention on Human Rights. But there was a case quite a few years ago called Suring against the United Kingdom, where the court ordered that Britain should not extradite someone to the United States unless there was assurance from the United States that this person would not be held on death row. But that was on the basis of the person's particular susceptibility. What really sticks in the throat in this case, as has already been pointed out, is that not only the Asperger's syndrome, but the fact that there appears to be utter discrimination on the part of Theresa May and on the part of the authorities. And as has been pointed out, in one case there are threats to commit suicide. In the other case, the guy is Muslim, and this would not arise, of course. And simply for that reason, it would appear that Gary McKinnon is not to be sent back, but he has been sent back. And the European Court, actually, what I would really criticize them for is failing to engage with that issue.
Hamja, are you clear now what the legal process is and what the timescale might be in the United States, or is it just that Talha's in prison and there's kind of it being indefinitely held almost?
Talha's trial has been actually delayed from October to March 2014, so he spends at least a year and a half in solitary confinement. United Nations Special Rapporteur said no one should spend longer than 14 days in such conditions because of the irreversible mental damage it causes, and he's spending like a year and a half. Based on precedents, like an earlier extradition case of Fahad Hashmi, who actually mentally broke down after so long in such a condition. The other precedent is the sort of plea bargaining system in America, which David Davis, the Conservative MP, brought up. Meaning you basically get a really heavy sentence and you just whittle down to the best possible deal. That's what's happened to all the British extradition cases, and also even the bankers and so forth, and happens in 98% of American federal cases anyway. So it's very difficult even, Talha always denied the charges. He was just never given the chance to openly contest that. Things are going to be a nightmare now. It's just a question of how bad or damping down the damage and that sort, really.
Did they give any reason for the delay in the trial?
The delay in the trial, from the American prosecutor's point of view, is because they have one terabyte of computer data to go through. So Talha's accused of being this a sort of marginal associate of a website from 1997, so as far back as 16 teenager to about 2002. So the actual website wasn't even online for 4 years until he got arrested too. So
it was offline for 4 years before he was arrested?
Yeah, basically. So yeah, just to clarify, yeah. And there's no. The major thing about the 2003 extradition treaty is that it removed the requirement of prima facie evidence. The most outrageous post 9/11 miscarriage of justice was the Loti Rahaisi case, which was an Algerian pilot falsely accused of training the 9/11 hijackers, who the Home Office now pays £2 million in compensation. But back in those days, in 2001, you had to provide a prima facie evidence case in a court of law before extradition, because extradition is a punishment in and of itself. People aren't sacks of carrots. You can't just rip someone from their family home to a death row type prison regime. Extradition is there for fugitives, and if it's used for any other purpose, it's an abuse of extraterritorial jurisdiction. And it affects all of us. It's not just a Muslim issue, it affects all British citizens, and everyone should sleep less easily at night based on these precedents.
Bill, has anything that Theresa May has done since, we know that she introduced, this reform to the process immediately after these cases, is it a significant reform?
Of course it's a significant reform. And I think she was coming under huge pressure from members of her own party. I mean, there was extreme discontent at what happened to the bankers, for example, from Conservative members of Parliament. But even so, the issue of discrimination, I think, is, the reform which is being introduced does not address that issue. And why a British person
what does
is
it do? Just explain for viewers what did happen with Talha and what wouldn't happen now.
So the issue being that there has to be a court hearing now in this country, which there wouldn't be so far, to determine whether the person should be tried here in this country on the basis of that evidence. So trouble is we don't have a very wonderful record ourselves.
Victoria, do you think that what Theresa May did after this case is a significant difference?
Yeah, I think it is a significant difference, John, but in the way that Bill has outlined. but there's just one thing I would just like to throw in for your listeners at this point, which is that as somebody who gets very frequent letters and cards from Talha, and I know obviously Hamja speaks to him every week, but I would just like to add in the note that Talha is the most amusing, generous, interesting letter writer you could possibly imagine. And I would just like your listeners and viewers to be able to have in their mind the image of somebody who is a friend that any of us would value, and the way his spirit is still so strong after everything that's happened to him is something I would very much like to emphasize.
Hamja, is that your feeling? You know, you're in contact with Talha more than anybody, presumably. That's a remarkable thing that Victoria says, that he still has a strong spirit under these circumstances.
Yeah, there's always the courage and dignity of those who've been subject to the worst abuses but still emerge with sort of grace and beauty. Talha's also an award-winning poet. He's even teaching himself Latin in prison, for all things. I actually drew tremendous inspiration from people like the Hillsborough campaign, who I've worked with in Talha's campaign, the Hillsborough Justice Campaign, and people who've struggled for their relatives who've died in police custody, because it's often the same institutions like the Department of Public Prosecutions or the Crown Prosecution Service or the Conservative government, which has messed them over too. And there's actually a good lineage to be drawn from, and it's not just the dignity of Talha, but Victoria's written an excellent book called Shadow Lives, which I recommend everyone reads, and it's about the dignity of the families who've been subjected to such horrible, terrifying abuses, but can just get on with their daily lives. I mean, my mum does cry every day, and you can hear the pain in her voice, and Theresa May would boast about this at the Conservative Party conference, but just getting along with, you're just going from day-to-day life, these sort of families, even Abdul, Bary's family, just the kids and the mothers, the sort of burden that places on them on a sort of everyday mother thing. But it's a sort of quiet dignity, and it's sort of heroic but quite ordinary as well.
Bill, do you ever think that we'll get a regime which doesn't do this to people? I mean, anybody who has a political history in this country will find that reminiscent of the conditions under which Irish prisoners were held.
Precisely. I would love to see a Labour leadership take a stand on these kind of issues. The trouble is in the Labour Party as well is that a lot of people are so deeply implicated in what's happened over the years, as you rightly point out, with Hillsborough, with the Irish issues and so on, and have never really been tackled. And so, really hope that there will be the maximum public campaign on these issues. And it's very simple, as a matter of fact. I mean, it's not as if it's something terribly complicated. I think particularly the discrimination issue.
Hamja, do you sense that there is a sort of, you've mentioned some of the petition campaigns and whatnot, do you get a sense that among sort of ordinary citizens in this country there's an understanding that something badly wrong has happened here?
There's still a lot of work to do. I mean, unfortunately, I don't have the same power as like the Daily Mail, for example. And I do think the actual pivotal factor in Gary McKinnon's not being extradited was the fact that Daily Mail backed his campaign with a campaign against extradition called British Justice for British Citizens, whilst referring to Talha and Babar, British-born Muslims, as other unwanted guests. And we'll see with the Smear and Miliband, what...
I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it right there. That's all we've got time for. Do rejoin us next week for more news from analysis.